sentence. The problem with systemic racism is that if you adjust for variables other than race, most of the gaps that the people who talk about systemic racism bring up vanish almost totally. And this becomes apparent if you extend your analysis beyond just black people and white people to say Asians or Jews, who take, in many cases, as much prejudice as blacks, certainly more than whites, but who outperform both groups. That debunks the entire theory unless you somehow think the USA was set up to systemically advantage Koreans. So, I mean, just like to give an example of how the cultural variables work, this is the one I usually use when I speak, but the average working black guy makes, in terms of what's called personal income, so we don't get into households or complications or, are women marrying these days or whatever, just personal income for males. The average black guy makes about 80%, 85% of what the average white guy does. This has been a trick types to racism basically forever, going back to the 1970s. But a while ago, when the gap was bigger than it is now, two people, the government economist June O'Neill and the conservative researcher, who at the time was pretty nonpartisan, Dinesh D'Souza, actually took a look at this income data using what are called GAO, Government Accounting Office figures for the population. And they found that the gap almost goes away if you adjust for just a few things. Like one was age, which doesn't have anything to do with race or racism whatsoever. It's a purely situational cultural variable. But because black families have more kids, so do Hispanic families, Eastern European families, the most common age for a black guy is 27. The most common age for a white guy is 58. You can Google that just by going to Pew average age different races. It's a pretty non-contested fact. But that drives down black incomes. You're not going to be a senior executive or a military officer beyond maybe first bar lieutenant at 27, 25. So that's one of them. Another variable was residency. So like blacks and whites both make less in the South, and they make fairly similar incomes if you're looking at like Mississippi or Arkansas, but there are more black people that live in the South. I don't want to be glib, I'm pro-black, but that's kind of where the boats landed. I mean, like the slave trade was conducted with the southern ports like New Orleans and Charleston. So when when these captured warriors got off the boat, they were in the South. So today, the South has a lot more black people. They don't make dramatically less than whites in the South, but wages are lower in the South. You have to adjust for region. Another thing was just number of years, not quality, which is a class thing that could reflect racism in the past, but just number of years of education. Did you trust the educational system and stay in school? That was the third. And the fourth was any standardized test score. Like, what's your tested IQ on the math portion? If you adjust for just those four things, the gap that's attributed to some kind of sneaky racism out there in the system goes away totally. So my comment is that what we're seeing when we see group performance differences isn't some kind of hidden racism you need a genius consultant to track down. It's easily measurable differences between the groups in things like tested math ability. Like, that's really wonky, but it's accurate. And again, we see this when you just look at, for example, Asians. One of the things that someone once bet me like $50 I couldn't win a debate with the alt-right and the social justice movement in an image. And I actually thought about it for a while, and then I pulled up the US income figures and just sent it to them. And they were like, okay, I don't know whether cash changed hands or not, but it was sort of like, okay, this kind of does it. Number one was Indian Americans. Number two, I think, was Nigerians, Japanese Americans, Filipinos. Like, there was no way, either as a genetic bigot or as a social justice whiner, you could explain the presence of Arabs or West Africans or whatever in that number two spot, or Indians in that number one spot. So if you just move to groups that do better than whites on those variables, like how long do you wait to have a kid? How many degrees do you have? Those groups predictably also do better than whites financially. You can see a slight effect of bigotry. Asians make like 2% less than you would expect them to do because they're a coastal population. But in general, Asians are kicking everyone's ass when it comes to income and educational test scores. So that to me is the rebuttal to systemic racism. Like, only a fool would deny that bigotry in the past has harmed blacks, or for that matter, Boston Irishmen or Native Americans or something like that. But there's a difference between saying we may be more likely to start out with a young single mom because of incidents in the past. On the one hand, maybe that could be true. There's a difference between that and saying, on the other hand, a black guy will be treated dramatically differently from an equally qualified white guy. That was true in 1954. That's not true today. If I were to go back into the business world and apply for jobs on major trading floors, I would be hired overnight. I don't think I'd be treated any differently from a white guy, but if I was, I might have a slight advantage because, I mean, there's still black people are 13% of the population, or only 9% of that field, as I recall. So a boss who has his eye on the company diversity goals might prefer to have me in there. But the gap that you see when you look at the treatment of young black people is not race itself, it's characteristics associated with that. And when you adjust for those characteristics like poverty and test scores, most of the gap goes away. There still, of course, are some hardcore racists. But that's systemic racism, and that's my response to it.